Namaste and welcome to Pramanik Astrology channel. Today we have with us one of the most prominent Vedic astrologer, Dennis Harness. Welcome Dennis to Pramanik Astrology.
Thank you, Prasad.
Yes. And what you're going to share with us. When you are here, we want to talk about Nakshatras. And first of all, I want to know, how did you get into astrology? What is your journey into astrology?
Yeah, that's a good question. I always say that it was that past life in Tibet,
Yes.
that really got me into this. But in this lifetime, when I was about a 12-year-old boy, I was drawn to astrology. I memorized the signs of the zodiac, in tropical or Western astrology. And I became even more keenly interested in it as I got more into my adolescence and young adult life. And, at the time when I was studying astrology, I was primarily looking at Western astrology. And then I was told about a man named Chakrapani Ulal from Kerala area of India, who lived in Santa Monica, California, and he was Swami Muktananda's astrologer. So I was told about him in 1980, so that's 40 years ago. And I went to see him, and it was just a very profound experience. It felt like I was like somebody that knew me so intimately, even though we had just very first met. And he said during the session, I know your mind very well, perhaps better than you.
Wow.
By the end of the session, he had convinced me of that. He made several predictions. He told me I would be married twice, and I hadn't even been engaged once, so that was a little disconcerting. But sure enough, I have been married twice, and the second marriage is we've been together over 30 years now. So first marriage, it went up in smoke very quickly. And, if I look at my chart, I see that Venus has combust the sun in my chart, and I have Saturn ruling the 7th house. So it just shows a more success with the later marriage. So I could see where he was coming from, even as I was just starting to study Vedic astrology. But it wasn't until really 1987 that I was introduced to a book called Ancient Hindu Astrology for the Modern Western Astrologer by James Braha. And that kind of was a bridge for me. It allowed me to get more into Vedic astrology because of my Western astrology roots. So, and then I started, doing consultations throughout. Actually, it's been over 30 years now.
Wow.
So that's how I got into it. And then I had a number of great teachers over the years: David Frawley, Dr. David Frawley, Hart Defoe, James Braha, as I mentioned, just to name a few of the main teachers that had a strong influence on me early on, and Dr. B.V. Raman from Bangalore, India.
Great. So how was this transition from the Western astrology to the Vedic astrology? So you said you went to visit to the Chakrapani Ullal in Kerala, but what made you go towards the Vedic astrology?
I just found that my placements of my planets made much more sense. But at the time when I met Chakrapani, there was one book called Predictive Hindu Astrology by Dr. B.V. Raman. And I bought a copy of it and I tried to read it, but there were a lot of, Sanskrit terminology, Hindi terms in it. So it was a little dense for me to get through. But so it wasn't until 87 when I encountered James Braha's book that it just finally the doors opened more fully for me. And so that was when I really got into studying it more in depth, was in 1987.
Right. So you were learning the Parashara Horashastra, like Parashar?
Correct.
Okay. And
yeah.
what made you get into the Nakshatra?
I always say that it was love that got me into the Nakshatras. I had met a woman who was, she was the secretary for Swami Hariharananda, who is from Puri, India, from Orissa. And she told me about this technique of comparing the moon nakshatras for compatibility. And so I was very keen on this because I'd gone through a divorce and I didn't want to make the same mistake twice. So if I was dating someone, I would ask her, I said, well, how many points do we have? Because you can get anywhere from like 0 to 36 points on moon compatibility, you know.
Wow.
And she said, she would tell me how many points. And so then I would be dating someone else a month or two later, and I'd say, well, how many points do I have with this woman? And so finally she said, quit bothering me. Why don't you go and buy this book by B.V. Raman called Muhurta?
Wow.
And in that book, Muhurta, or electional astrology, there's a whole section on relationship compatibility. And so anyway, long story short, I ordered the book from this bookstore that I did readings at. And the manager of the bookstore said, well, it's going to take a while for this book to get here. You better be patient. So sure enough, that afternoon, the package arrived on sea freight from India, which takes, you know, several weeks to get to the United States by ship. And this was, you know, this is a long time ago. This was back in 1988. And so the manager of the bookstore, when I came up to the counter, he said, "Did you order this book?" And it was Muhurta by B.V. Raman. And I said, "Yeah, I just placed the order, you know, earlier this morning." And he said, "Well, the freight just arrived from India, and whoever ordered the book is gone. They've left. So do you want the book?" So when the students are ready, the teacher appears. The book appears, yeah. So, and then I got into studying it because I just thought, wow, this is really fascinating. So I wanted to learn more about the Nakshatras. So that's why I always say that love got me involved with the Nakshatras.
Yes. Then where did you study Nakshatra? Because I see when I started learning about Nakshatra, it's your book which I read first. It is back then. But where did you learn from about the Nakshatras?
You know, besides being introduced to it in the Muhurta, the electional astrology book by Dr. Raman, I ran across some books by a writer and a Vedic astrologer from Delhi, from New Delhi, named his name is Bipin Bahari. I don't know if you've run across any of his books.
Yes.
But he wrote a book called Myths and Symbols in Vedic Astrology.
Yes.
And in that book, he describes the 27 nakshatras. And that really got me more involved in it, you know, more fully involved in learning the nakshatras. And the other book that I also found interesting was a book by Hart Defoe called Light on Life, written by Hart Defoe and Robert Svoboda. So those books really got me more interested in the nakshatras in my study. And so what I would do is I would teach my students, and I would collect notes on each of the nakshatras. And over the course of several years, a couple of years, I collected quite a bit of the material. It took me, I was probably collecting the material for about 7 years or something like that for that small book.
Yes. And that is a precious book, because I see when I read that book, it has all the it is not only about the moon in the nakshatra, it is also about the sun in the nakshatra, ascendant in the nakshatra, and examples of the people with the same placement. That is
Correct.
So very helpful while studying it. It was fascinating. So you collected all this information while teaching to your students.
Yeah, and my students kept on saying, you know, you should write a book on this, you know, you should come, you know, so they were kind of pushing me to do the book. So that's kind of how it came about.
Great. It was wonderful. So we have many questions about nakshatras. As there is nothing much written on the nakshatras, we have several questions. The first question which comes to my mind is, how do you judge a planet through nakshatra? Suppose I have a planet, it can be an ascendant lord, 12th lord, any kind of lord, or self-defining or defining a career. And when it goes into certain nakshatras, what is the first thing you look for? Do you have any framework which you look for, or the best practices to see the planets through nakshatras?
Well, as you've said with my book, the primary focus of it has been the moon nakshatra, or the birth star. the sun nakshatra and the rising sign nakshatra.
Yes.
You can look and see of a planet that rules a house, for example, say the ruler of the 10th house, where that planet is placed in the nakshatras may tell you something about the person's career interest. And in my book, I have a section for each of the nakshatras on career interests.
Yes.
So, for example, let's just say person's, moon rules the 10th house, and they have the nakshatra of the moon is Ashwini. So Ashwini is connected with health and healing.
Right.
And so there may be some interest for that person in holistic health, natural healing, psychology, metaphysics, mysticism, because it's ruled by Ketu. So it gives a strong flavor of maybe the career karma, depending on what planet rules the 10th house. So that's one example. And it just, what I recommend, because, to be honest, I never did the full research on each of the planets in the nakshatras.
Wow.
I actually ran across a book one time in India about Ashwini, and it was a whole 50-page book just on Ashwini.
Wow.
And he went through the nakshatras, in terms of planets in the nakshatras, all that, what each planet, like Saturn in Ashwini, for example, which would be debilitated, so it would be more challenging there, for example. But I never saw him do the second book on Bharani, the second nakshatra. So I think he exhausted himself after doing the first book.
So true.
So that's some research that really needs to be done. To my knowledge, I haven't run across too much, let's just say, Venus through the 27 nakshatras. I've seen bits and pieces of it, but have you ran across that at all in your studies?
No, in fact, that is the challenge, because I see the planets through the rashis, but I don't see the planets through nakshatras. Then the most challenging part is the pada, rashi, ruler, and deity. Like I have a Mars in the first pada of the Capricorn sign in the Uttarashada Nakshatra or Shravan Nakshatra. Then it is exalted, it is into the enemy sign, it might be into Aries pada. So, and it may have some lordship into the main birth chart. So it is quite overwhelming to really interpret this. So what students should focus on while analyzing it?
I would just say, again, there's several good books on the nakshatras, like I mentioned, Hart Defoe's book, Light on Life, and Beppan Bahari's book, Myths and Symbols in Vedic Astrology. And of course, my book is a good primer, good introduction to the nakshatras. I would suggest taking the planet and looking and seeing, of course, what nakshatra it's in, and then reading the different books on the flavor of the nakshatras and seeing how that planet may embody certain things, like you said, the deity associated. Right. Because I think wherever the Lagna Lord is placed, whatever nakshatra that's in, that to me would be the fourth most important thing to look at, besides the Lagna, the moon, and the sun, would be the Lagna Lord, to see which nakshatra that's placed in. And then that may give you a flavor, and the deities associated with the nakshatras. It may be good to, let's just say, if the person has Leo rising, and the sun is in, again, let's just say in Ashwini, for example, in the star of healing. Good for that person to read up on Ashwini in the different books, and they may find that there is this draw towards health and healing. For example. Yes. So that's one way that you can work with this.
Because
but there's the research hasn't been done.
Right.
So you bring up an excellent question. Yes. So maybe you have to do the research.
Yes, as a student, when just like you were teaching students, writing notes, and you had a wonderful piece of information, the gem of the Nakshatra book you had. So those who are seeking the knowledge and want to invest into the knowledge and are ready to take the efforts, what they should take notes of, so that maybe 10 years down the line they have something very valuable.
Yeah. So maybe maybe a good way to probably an easier way to just do it, first of all, would be the Lagna Lord, the Ascendant Lord, and say the 10th House Lord. And then look and see with their clients as they're, and collect notes of when that Lagna Lord is placed in a certain nakshatra, what is played out for that person? What maybe are some of the common characteristics for that person, and see if it matches up with other clients that they're seeing. But at the end of the day, I think it's good to, with each nakshatra, to pick maybe 5 to 10 key words for each of the nakshatras. Maybe 10 would be better. And just to commit those to memory, of like what deity is associated with the nakshatra. Like with Ashwini, the first nakshatra are the Ashwins, the twins that ride in a golden chariot and bring healing energy down to the earth plane. So again, we have that symbol of healing connected with Ashwini. But it's ruled by Ketu. So also just always think of what planet rules the nakshatra. And that's very important because, particularly for the moon, because that tells us, according to Vimshotri Dasha system, what dasha they were born in.
Right.
And so that's very valuable information, of course. And, you could look at other factors, in terms of, is the nakshatra connected more with the principle of dharma or artha or kama or moksha? So that may give you also an indication. So there's several different factors. I'm a psychologist by training, so I also looked at the psychological aspects of each nakshatra as well. So Ashwini, for example, there is a tendency sometimes with Ashwini, because of Ketu ruling it, is that there can still be sometimes some introversion, even though it's in Aries. There can still be some introversion sometimes. Let's just say if Ashwini is the moon nakshatra or the rising sign nakshatra. So there can be that strong desire towards mysticism, towards metaphysics, towards spirituality because of the Ketu influence. So we see these factors playing out. So I think at the end of the day, it's just really going through the chart and then asking the person questions. Again, it gets so broad if you try to do every planet. That I think if you stay with maybe looking at the Ascendant Lord and the 10th Lord, in addition to Sun, Moon, and Ascendant, probably be a good place to start. Maybe the 7th Lord too. The 7th Lord may tell you some qualities about the marriage partner.
Because, for example, if I have certain planets in Bharni is ruled by Venus, but its deity is Yama.
Right.
Now, this is confusing. Like, what Yama has to do with the Venusian qualities? How do you look at these things? So, same framework we have to look for if somebody's ascendant lord is into the Bharni Nakshatra.
Well, sometimes I find with Bharani Nakshatra, because of its rulership by Venus, is that there's can be a tremendous amount of creativity associated with that person. And they may have some gift in the fine arts, music, dance, drama, theater, or writing, literature. I find sometimes Bharani is really good nakshatra for writers. But you could also look at Lord Yama, being the deity associated with that, because Bharani is called the star of restraint. So sometimes the person may feel psychologically somewhat restrained or restricted. Yama is, of course, connected with the yamas and niyamas, the things that we should be practicing in terms of ahimsa, nonviolence, things like that. So it does have an influence that keeps us kind of in check, that holds us in check. So the person may feel a little bit confined or imprisoned by this world too. So you can take those different qualities and then weave them together and see. And again, at the end of the day, is if it makes sense to the client, if it's helpful for the client, that's the most important thing, most important factor.
Wow. Yes. Okay, I have one more question with this. Apart from, like, when we are using Vimshottari Mahadasha, we are using Nakshatra as a predictive tool and a technique.
Correct.
But apart from Vimshottari Mahadasha, do you use Nakshatra as a predictive tool? How do you use it? Like, apart from Vimshottari Mahadasha?
Oh, well, again, as a predictive tool,
Yes.
yeah.
Is there any established
yes.
predictive tool apart from
Well,
Vimshottari Mahadasha?
again, like, for example, right now as we speak, Rahu and Ketu, Rahu is in the Nakshatra, connected with
Destruction.
destruction, with Ardra, and Ketu is in the Nakshatra Mula, also connected with Kali, with destruction. So we see that these two nakshatras of the nodes, the lunar the nodes of the moon, are connected with these challenging nakshatras. And of course, we've seen this virus come out during this time, this pandemic happening. And then also, if we look back in time to the last time, which is about 18 and a half years ago, would have been 9/11. And if you look back 18 and a half years before that, was the AIDS epidemic.
Yes.
And if you keep looking back, you'll see the JFK assassination, which was a major event in the United States. And then before that was the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So each time that the nodes go into these particular nakshatras, it can bring a challenge aspect.
Oh.
So they can be predictive in that way too, by just looking at the qualities. Now, it's interesting to note, for example, Rahu will be leaving, moving on from Ardra into Mrigashira on April the 22nd.
Yes.
So that may start to give some relief from this virus, Of course, depending on what part of the world you live in, it may vary, but there can be some shift that starts to happen as Rahu leaves Ardra. So you can use it for predictive in terms of mundane astrology, like world events, things like that as well.
Okay, so I have one more question in my mind. I want to know more about the 12th house. Like 12th house has so many negative connotations to it. Like it is the house of expense, it's the house of loss. And whenever there is an involvement of the 12th house, there is these elements of loss, and which is to some extent true. So what is your take on the 12th house? How do you look at that 12th house? Can you please enlighten us with that?
Yeah, I mean, the 12th house is, I wrote an article on my website. My website is just dennisharness.com. And under articles, there's an article that I wrote called The 12th House, Misery or Moksha. Because the 12th house is the house of loss and expenditure and imprisonment, confinement, things like that. But it's also the house of ashrams. It's the house of meditation. It's the house of yoga. It's the house of moksha, of spiritual liberation, of self-realization.
Right.
So people that have a strong 12th house, I happen to have 4 planets in the 12th house. So because I use the outer planets. I'm a little different than most Vedic astrologers. I use the outer planets. I use Uranus, Neptune, Pluto. So if you count Uranus and Pluto, I have Moon, Jupiter, Uranus, Pluto, all in the 12th house. So because it gets such a bad rap most of the time, because it's a Dushtana, house of difficulty.
Yes.
Yeah. I call it the eek, freak, squeak house. It's kind of,
what's that?
It freaks people out. It just freaks people out sometimes.
Yeah.
But I had an interesting story that happened to me a number of years ago when I was in my early 20s. I went to a Western astrologer, and the Western astrologer told me that I should be careful because I could end up in prison or in jail. I think he said you could end up in jail. And so because I had he saw I had Saturn transiting through my 12th house and going over my Moon and Jupiter, for that matter. And so he made this prediction about that. And it was really, of course, it got me really worried and concerned and all that. But anyway, in the interim, I moved to California. And when I arrived in California, the first job I got was working in a juvenile hall, like a prison for youth, and I was a counselor.
Wow.
And sometimes I would be locked up with the kids for 16 hours. I would have to do a double shift. And it was literally like I was in prison, you know.
Wow.
So I thought that was a way that the karma played out, was that rather than having to go to prison, I got a job working in one.
And you are literally in a prison for 16 hours a day?
Sometimes.
But you are a free man. So your
Correct.
karma has been paid off by being
Correct.
into prison, the 12th house. It is so fascinating.
So we just don't know sometimes how it's going to play out. You know, it's very interesting. So in my article, you know, I go through all the planets in the 12th house and just some of the different qualities that can happen with planets in the 12th house. But I'll give you an example. I have Jupiter there, you know. So Jupiter in the 12th house can be good for moksha, for spiritual liberation, because Jupiter is the guru planet. But it can also sometimes indicate expansive losses. So it doesn't always mean...
We will expand that to
So, you know, the person has to learn to, as my teacher Sri Yukteswar would say, you have to learn to live within your purse if you have Jupiter in the 12th house, to not be too extravagant with your spending money.
With charity?
So yeah, and then that's a great idea. One of the greatest remedial measures I think any of us can do is to do charitable work or to give to charities. So Jupiter is that way. It also can indicate connections with the nonprofit organizations. And I ran a nonprofit organization since from 92 to 99, or 2000, 92 to actually 2009, excuse me. So I ran, nonprofit organizations for 17 years, something like that. And so 12th house can be connected with nonprofits, I find, as well. And not that I wasn't paid for my work, because I was, but I was still running this nonprofit for all those years.
Yes, amazing.
But then Jupiter in the 12th house and can sometimes indicate separation from children. Not always, but my first marriage, I had a son, and so I was separated from him part of the time. So the karma came in different ways. But I also find the 12th house is connected with money. People always think of it as a house of loss.
Yes.
But it is the second house from the 11th.
Yes, second. Yeah.
So I always figured that it's connected with, and the 11th house is the house of wealth, or labhya, or gain, profits and gains.
Right.
So I always considered it connected with the some wealth. So it's kind of like sometimes hidden treasures.
Right.
Or the check's always in the mail. Like if the person's needing the money, that somehow things arrive. There's some kind of divine intervention, sometimes financially. There can be that. And money can come in unusual ways, sometimes with the 12th house, is the point.
Wow. And the lords will also play, it's like 12th lord in...
for example, the 12th lord in the 12th house is called Vimala Yoga.
Yes.
Vimala means like unblemished. And they say if the lord of the 12th house is in the 12th house, especially if it's a benefic planet, like the moon or Jupiter or Venus or even sun there in the 12th in its own sign, that can indicate that the person will attain heaven after their death.
Wow.
That they'll have a blessed future birth. So the 12th house I always connect with our future life as well.
Wow.
Where the first house is kind of connected with the beginning of life or the birth. The 12th house is sometimes connected with the loss of the physical body, of leaving the body. So it's kind of like, I call the first house the womb and the 12th house the tomb. So it's moving from the womb to the tomb.
Yes. We are dissolving into the universal energy.
Exactly. Yeah.
Enlightenment. Okay. So what else? Do you also use it for the 12th house as a foreign source and, any connection of the 10th lord or any such career signifying factors connected with the 12th house?
Yeah.
In accordance with the Mahadasha, do you see something like that with the 12th house?
I find, for example, the 10th lord in the 12th house, for example, that quite often it can indicate the person needs to actually seek some independence from work, to keep some independence, because otherwise they can feel imprisoned by a job. So it's very important for them not to get into a position where they feel imprisoned by their job, by their work. So that's sometimes I've found that to be true. Or when the 10th house ruler is in the 8th house, I find that as well. So the person generally would be happier working on their own, or working where they have control over a department or something, where they're not micromanaged too much.
Okay.
So there can be that aspect.
And what about the 12th lord into the 10th house? As against 10th lord into the 12th house?
Yeah, the 12th lord into the 10th house, I find there can be some delays around finding one's career dharma, some confusion or doubt, things like that. It could indicate the desire to do some spiritual work on either side, both ends.
Okay.
There could be some desire to do charitable work, spiritual work as well.
Yes, and one more question I have. You are conducting a Vedic Astrology Conference in November. Like, can you tell me about it? Because I see that it's in November in Sedona, Arizona, where you live. And what's it all about? When did you start it in, and who can join it? Can you tell us more about it?
Well, I started the conferences back in 1992, so it's been about 27 years.
Wow.
And this conference in Sedona is very magical, because Sedona is a very mystical place.
Yes.
It has these beautiful red rocks and this gorgeous hiking trails, and it's where the Native American Indians used to come to do their sacred ceremonies and rituals. They never lived in Sedona. They lived on the outskirts of Sedona, because this was their temple where they came to pray and to do their vision quests. And so we have the conference here. So it's kind of it is a magical location for people to come to. It's like a pilgrimage coming to Sedona.
Yes.
And we put on, the conference is primarily focused on Vedic astrology. Actually, the website is just very simple. It's just SedonaVedicAstrology.com.
Yes.
And people from all over the world come. It's an international conference. There's usually about 200 attendees.
Okay.
And we have 28 speakers this year from all over the world coming to teach. And the classes are on Vedic astrology, but there are also beginner classes, intermediate classes, advanced classes. So there's something for everyone. And then we even have yoga classes going throughout the whole conference.
Wow.
And meditation and mantra and Ayurveda and Vastu. And so it's a number of different Vedic sciences are covered. So there's really something for everyone. So people that are interested in coming, I would say just go and check out the website, SedonaVedicAstrology.com. We'll actually have we should have the schedule up by the end of the month. We've been working on the schedule, and we have it done. We just haven't put it on the website yet. So it's just getting ready to be uploaded onto the website this next week or so.
Okay. I will definitely put a link to that website.
Oh, fantastic.
But who can join it? Like, if somebody is just seeking astrology, he's not a professional astrologer, he can join it and learn.
Yeah, anybody can come, from beginning students to intermediate advanced students, and it's open to the public. So you don't have to be a member to come to the conference. You just have to have a curious, inquisitive mind.
Yes, correct.
And then, you're allowed in the door if you have an open mind, curious mind.
Yes, with open mind and open heart, anyone can join in.
Right, exactly. That's a good point. Open mind, open heart.
Yes. Okay. So what would be your final advice to those who are learning into Nakshatras, and any final word of advice before we?
Yeah, I think that it's really important to feel that commitment, to feel that deep commitment, to really want to study. And in India, actually, I heard the story that some teachers in India would not take you on as a student unless you could recite the 27 Nakshatras.
Yes.
So, I think for beginning students, I think a good way is to create like flashcards where you have, say, for example, the sun and Surya on one side of the card, and then you had 5 to 10 key significations for each planet.
Wow.
and then had 5 to 10 key significations for each house, and then for each sign, and then for each nakshatra. So if you learn that, you know, it's like learning those fundamentals. That's, you know, half the battle. It's just setting that foundation. But those things you just have to really, you know, commit to memory. And you have to realize it's a vast ocean of knowledge. You know, you're not going to learn it in a weekend seminar.
Yes.
So you really need to be willing to study. It's kind of like it's just it is just a vast ocean, and you're always learning from birth till death if you take on astrology. But I think it is like Yogananda's book, The Divine Romance. I think it's you have to kind of fall in love with it.
Yes.
You know, I think people are meant to that are meant to study or to practice astrology. It's almost like destiny in a way.
Wow.
There's a certain karma to want to do, and to be a professional astrologer, I usually find in the chart a strong Mercury and or Jupiter. And, you know, because Jupiter is the counselor and Mercury is the calculations and the communication, teaching aspect of it. But of course, all the planets are important. But I find especially a strong Mercury is really helpful to be a practicing astrologer, that is.
Yes. Thank you, Dennis, for coming on Harmonic Astrology and sharing all your knowledge and so many insights on the questions which were really challenging for us, like planets through nakshatras and all that, and making sense to us. Thank you. And we want many more interviews from you.
All right, Prasad. So great to connect with you.
Thank you.
Namaskar.
Namaskar.